From George Ivanovich Gurdjieff's All and Everything. Chapter 42. Beelzebub in America. Reading 4. Now, my boy, that we have mentioned this queer upstart writer, there is nothing for it but to inform you here of a certain perplexity which already long ago arose in me in regard to him, and which has progressively increased, and that is concerning a naivety of his. I must explain that from the very beginning of his responsible existence, he also became, whether by accident or by the will of fate, I do not know, a follower, and in fact a very devout follower of our wise and esteemed Mullah Nasser ad-Din. And furthermore, in the ordinary process of his being existence, he has never lost the smallest opportunity to act entirely according to Mullah Nasser ad-Din's unprecedentedly wise and inimitable sayings. And now, according to the information which has reached me by ethogram, all of a sudden he appears to be constantly acting contrary to one of the very serious and exceptionally practical counsels, certainly not accessible to everybody, of this teacher above all teachers, which is formulated in the following words. Brother, here on the earth, if you speak the truth, you are a great fool, whereas if you wriggle with your soul, you are only a scoundrel, though also a big one. So it is best of all to do nothing, but just recline on your divan and learn to sing like the sparrow that had not yet turned into an American canary. Now, my boy, absorb carefully the information about the causes of the gradual disharmonization in the presences of these contemporary beings of the continent America, of their second fundamental being function, namely the function of sex. The disharmony of this function in them is due also to several causes of diverse character, but the fundamental cause, in my opinion, is their negligence, engendered in their essence and already quite fused with their nature, in keeping their sex organs clean. Just like the beings of the continent of Europe, the care they give to their faces and their use of what is called facial cosmetics are only equaled by their neglect of these said organs of theirs, whereas more or less conscious three-brained beings are required to observe the utmost cleanliness in respect to just these organs. They cannot, however, be entirely blamed because, in this respect, the beings of the continent of Europe are most at fault with their customs existing in the process of their ordinary being existence. The point is that this, as yet recently arisen, contemporary large group is almost exclusively formed and continues to be supplied with beings from various large and small groups populating the continent of Europe. The result is that even if the majority of the three-brained beings now composing this newly formed large group there are not themselves emigrants from the continent of Europe, their fathers or grandfathers were, who, migrating to this continent of America, took along with them also their European customs, among which were those which brought about this uncleanliness in respect of their sex organs. So, my boy, when I now tell you how the matter stands as regard the sex question among the Americans, bear in mind that everything I say will also refer to the beings of the continent Europe. The results of this uncleanliness of the contemporary three-brained beings of the planet Earth, who have taken your fancy and who breed on the continents of Europe and America, are very clearly indicated in my statistics. Let us take, for example, what are called their venereal diseases. These diseases are so widespread on the continent of Europe and on this continent of America that at the present time you will scarcely ever meet a being who has not one or another form of those diseases. There is no harm in your knowing, among other things, a little more about those interesting and peculiar data which in my statistics indicate in figures how much more of these diseases there is among the beings of the continents America and Europe than among those of the continent Asia. Many of these venereal diseases are entirely absent among the beings of the old communities of the continent of Asia, whereas among the beings populating the continents Europe and America, these diseases are almost epidemical. Let us take, for example, what is called clap, or as scientists there call it, gonorrhea. On the continent of Europe and America, almost all the beings, both of male and female sex, have this disease in one of its different stages. But on the continent Asia, it is met with only on the borders, where beings frequently mix with the beings of the continent of Europe. A good example of what has just been said are the beings belonging to the group existing there under the name Persia, which occupies a relatively large territory on the continent Asia. Among the beings dwelling in the central, eastern, southern, and western areas of this relatively large territory, the mentioned diseases are not to be found at all. But in the northern part, especially in the locality called Azerbaijan, which comes into direct contact with the large half-European, half-Asiatic community called Russia, the percentage of beings infected with this disease increases more and more in proportion to their proximity to this Russia. And exactly the same occurs in other eastern countries of the continent of Asia. The percentage of this disease increases proportionately to the contact of their beings with the beings of the continent of Europe. For example, in the country called India, and partly in China, this disease has in recent times become widespread among the beings there, chiefly in those places where they come into contact with European beings of the community England. It can thus be said that the chief disseminators of this disease among the beings of the continent Asia are, from the northwestern side, the beings of the large group Russia, and from the eastern side, the beings of the community England. The cause of the absence of this disease, as well as of many other evils in the said parts of the continent of Asia, is in my opinion that the majority of the beings of the continent Asia have several very good customs for their everyday existence, which have reached them likewise from their ancient ancestors. And these customs are so deeply implanted in their everyday existence by their religion that at the present time, observing them mechanically, without any wiseacring, beings are thereby more or less insured against several evils which, owing to the abnormally established conditions of being existence, have been gradually formed and still continue to be formed in uncountable numbers on that ill-fated planet. The beings of most of the groups on the continent Asia are safeguarded against many venereal diseases, as well as against any other sexual abnormalities, if only, for instance, by such customs known there by the names Suniat and Abdest. The first of these customs, namely Suniat, or as it is otherwise called circumcision, not only saves most of the Asiatic beings of responsible age from many venereal diseases there, but also safeguards many of the children and youths of the continent of Europe and America against, namely, that scourge known there under the name onanism. According to this custom, the beings of responsible age in most of the contemporary groups of the continent of Asia usually perform on their results, that is to say on their children, at a certain age a ritual which consists in this, that in the case of boys they cut what they call the frenum and prepuce of the penis. And today those children of your contemporary favorites, who of course automatically are subjects of this custom, are almost completely safeguarded against the inevitable result of several evils already definitely fixed in the process of the existence of your favorites. For example, according to my statistics, the said scourge, that is, children's onanism, is scarcely met with among the children of those three-brained beings there who observe the custom of circumcision, whereas all the children and youths of the beings who fail to observe this custom are without exception exposed to this same sexual abnormality. The second custom I mentioned, namely abdest, which by the way is called differently by the beings of different groups on the continent Asia, is nothing else than the obligatory ablution of the sex organs after every visit to what is called the toilet. Thanks chiefly to this second custom, Most of your favorites breeding on the continent of Asia are safeguarded against many venereal diseases and other sexual abnormalities there. Having said this, Beelzebub became thoughtful, and after a long pause said, "The present theme of our conversation has reminded me of a certain very interesting conversation which I had there during my sojourn in France with a young, sympathetic, three-brained being. I think that perhaps it would now be best for your understanding of all that has just been said, if I repeat to you that conversation in full. All the more so as, besides explaining the meaning of the custom abdest and ablution, this conversation will enlighten you on many further questions concerning the peculiar psyche of these favorites of yours." This same being, my conversation with whom I recall, and now intend to repeat to you, was just that young Persian who, you remember, as I have already told you, was at the request of our mutual acquaintances, my guide in the city of Paris, where I happened to be, as I have already told you, just before my departure to this same continent, America. One day I was waiting for this young Persian in a cafe in the city of Paris, as always the same grand cafe. When he arrived, I noticed by his eyes that this time he was, as they say there, more drunk than usual. In general, he always drank more than enough of the alcoholic liquids existing there, and when we happened to be together in Paris in the restaurants on Montmartre, where it was obligatory to order champagne, which I neither liked nor drank, he would always drink it all alone with great pleasure. Besides always drinking, he was also, as is said there, a great petticoat chaser. The moment he saw what they call there the pretty face of a being of the female sex, his whole body and even his breathing suddenly changed. When I noticed that he was this time more intoxicated than usual, and when, having sat down beside me, he ordered coffee, with which is called there an apéritif, I asked him, "Explain to me, please, my young friend, why do you always drink this poison?" To this question of mine he answered, my dear doctor, I drink this poison, in the first place because I am so accustomed to it that I cannot now stop drinking without suffering, and secondly, I drink it because, only thanks to the effect of the alcohol, can I calmly look on at the obscenity which goes on here," he added, waving his hand around. I began drinking this, as you called it, poison, because the accidental, and for me, unlucky and wretched circumstances of my life were so arranged that I had to come and live a long time in this maleficent Europe. I first began to drink because everybody here whom I met also drank, and unless you drink, you are called a woman, a girl, dolly, dearie, sissy, ninny, and similar derisive names. Not wishing my business acquaintances to call me by these offensive names, I also began to drink. And in addition, thanks also to the fact that when I first came over to Europe, conditions of life here in respect of morality and patriarchality were entirely in contrast with those conditions in which I was born and brought up. I, seeing and perceiving all this, used to experience a painful feeling of shame and an unaccountable embarrassment. At the same time, I noticed that from the effect of the alcohol I drank, not only was the depression I experienced alleviated, but I could look upon it all quite calmly, and even have the wish to participate in this abnormal life, so contradictory of my nature and my established views. Thus, it came about that every time I began to feel the same unpleasant sensation, I began to drink this alcohol, even with the feeling of some self-justification, and in this way became gradually accustomed to this, as you have quite justly called it, poison. Having said this with a perceptive impulse of heartfelt grief, he paused a while to puff at his cigarette mixed with tambac, and taking this opportunity, I asked him as follows, "Well, all right. Let us assume I have more or less understood your explanation of your inexcusable drunkenness and can put myself in your position. But what do you say about your other, and from my point of view, also inexcusable vice, namely your petticoat, drooling?" "Why, you run after every petticoat if only it hangs about someone with long hair." At this question of mine, he, sighing deeply, resumed his speaking as follows. It seems to me that I got this habit as well, partly for the reason I mentioned, but I think this weakness of mine can be explained by still another very interesting psychological cause. Of course, I expressed the desire to hear him, but first I suggested our going inside the Grand Café into the hall of the restaurant itself, as it was already getting damp out of doors. When we were seated in the hall of the restaurant and had ordered their famous champagne, he continued as follows. When you lived among us in Persia, my dear doctor, you perhaps happened to observe the attitude existing there, very specific for us Persians, of men towards women. Namely, among us in Persia, men have two definite, one can say, organic attitudes towards women, in accordance with which women are, for us men, even unconsciously on our part, very sharply divided into two categories. The first attitude is towards the woman, the present or future mother, and the second towards the woman female. This property of the men of our Persia, who have in their nature data for these two independent attitudes and for this instinctive feeling, began to be formed only recently, about 2.5 centuries ago. According to the explanations once given me by my mullah uncle, whom those around him called, behind his back, a mullah of the old school, it seems that 2 or 3 centuries ago, owing to causes evidently ensuing from certain higher world laws, men began to make war on each other everywhere on the earth, and especially among us in Asia, more intensively than usual, and at the same time, somehow in most of the men, the feeling of piety began very distinctly to decline, and in some of them entirely disappeared. And just at that period, a certain form of psychic disease spread among men, from which many who were infected by it ultimately either became quite insane or committed suicide. Then certain wise people of various independent groups on the continent of Asia began, with the help of various persons representative of medicine at that time, which, by the way, was then very superior to contemporary medicine, very earnestly to seek the causes of that human misfortune. After long impartial labors, they discovered, in the first place, that the men who contracted this disease were exclusively those in whose subconsciousness, for some reason or other, there never arose any impulse of faith in anybody or in anything, and secondly, that those adult men who periodically performed the normal ritual of intercourse with women were not at all subject to this disease. When the news of this conclusion of theirs spread over the continent of Asia, all the rulers and chiefs of the separate Asiatic groups of that time grew alarmed, as almost all the regular troops at their disposal consisted of adult men, and moreover, the constant wars permitted none of them to live normally with his family. In view of the fact that at that period all the governments of the separate Asiatic countries needed and wished to have healthy and strong armies, they were compelled to conclude a truce and either themselves assemble or send their representatives to one place, namely to the capital of what was then called the Kilmantushian Khanate, in order jointly to find a way out of the situation which had arisen. After serious reflections and deliberations, these rulers of the various independent groups of Asiatic peoples, or their representatives, together of course with the representatives of medicine of that time, then came to the conclusion that it was possible to deal with the situation which had arisen, only if what is called prostitution should be established everywhere on the continent of Asia, as is now the case on the continent of Europe, and only if the power-possessing people should deliberately encourage its development and cooperate in its success. Almost all the chiefs of the governments of that time fully agreed with this conclusion of the representatives of all the peoples of the continent of Asia, who had gathered together in the capital of the Kilmantushian Khanate, and without experiencing any remorse of conscience, they began from then on not only to encourage and aid women in general, except indeed just their own daughters, to engage in this occupation so abhorrently repulsive to the nature of every normal person, but also to give, even with a feeling of benevolence, as if this were the most considerate manifestation of man, every possible assistance to women, without distinction of caste or religion, who might wish to leave or to go anywhere for this filthy purpose. Now that we have touched upon this subject, allow me, respected doctor, to digress and tell you here the reflections, in my view, very interesting and wise, of this same mullah uncle of mine concerning the causes in general of the arising of this evil and scourge of contemporary civilization. Once, on one of the days of Ramadan, when we were conversing as usual while awaiting the call of the mullah of our district announcing the meal hour, and we happened to be speaking about this human scourge, he then, among other things, said, "It is wrong and unjust of you to blame and despise all women of this kind. Most of them are not themselves personally to blame for their sad lot. One should blame exclusively only their parents, husbands, and guardians. And precisely their parents, husbands, and guardians should be blamed and despised who have allowed the arising in them, during their age preparatory to adult being, while as yet they have not their own good sense, of the property called laziness. Although at this age this laziness is as yet only automatic in them, and young people have not to make very great efforts to overcome it, and are able in consequence, on acquiring their own good sense, not to allow it to gain complete control of them. Yet nevertheless, as regards the organization of woman's psyche, the active principle must, owing to results not dependent on our will but ensuing from world laws, unfailingly participate in every initiative and in every good manifestation of theirs. And it is just precisely in the early years of the adult life of these contemporary, unfortunate prospective woman mothers, thanks to the various ideas of the people of contemporary civilization concerning equal rights for women, existing there under the catchwords equal rights, equal opportunities, etc., ideas which are now already widespread everywhere on the earth, which are naive to the understanding of a man who has lived his life normally, and which are unconsciously accepted also by the majority of contemporary men, that these contemporary, not yet completely formed prospective women mothers, on the one hand, not having around them the law-conformable requisite sources of the active principle, such as their parents, guardians, and husbands, to whom the responsibility for them passes from the moment of marriage, and on the other hand, thanks to the intensive process of imagination and enthusiasms which is proper to proceed in them, and which is also in this transitional age foreordained by nature according to law, for the purpose of better actualizing the data for the development of their good sense, they, as it were, gradually absorb the said automatic laziness into their very nature, and this laziness remains in their nature as a progressive and indispensable necessity. A woman with such a nature, of course, does not wish to fulfill the obligations of a genuine woman mother, and in view of the fact that being a prostitute enables her just to do nothing and to experience great pleasure, there is gradually formed in her, both in her nature and in the passive consciousness, proper to her, a factor for the irresistible urge to be a woman female. But in consequence of the fact that in the instinct of each of these women, the data proper to all women for the impulse of shame are not atrophied suddenly and at once, and none of them, with all her mental wishing, can endure to become such a woman in her own native country. Every one of them always instinctively and half-consciously tries to get away to some other country where, far from her native land, without any inner discomfort, and also without doing anything, she can abandon herself entirely to this profession, personally pleasant for her in almost every respect. And as regards the prevalence everywhere on the earth at the present time of this human misfortune, the cause of this is, in my opinion, exclusively only those contemporary men in whom, owing to the same reasons, there arises, as in those young women, future prostitutes, a similar what is called organic, essential need to do nothing except enjoy oneself. And one of the forms of satisfying the criminal need of these ulcers among contemporary people consists in the given case, in enticing and assisting such women to leave their native land for some foreign country. It has already been noticed by many contemporary sensible people that these two different sexes, victims of the same disease, as a rule consciously and instinctively, seek and find each other, and in the given case they exemplify the proverb which has existed from olden times: one fisherman recognizes another from afar. And so, respected doctor, thanks just to the aforementioned causes wisely understood by my uncle, many women prostitutes from various other countries then appeared after several years among us in Persia. And owing to the instinctive attitudes which, as I have already said, had been acquired during centuries by the local women of Persia without distinction of religion towards morality and patriarchality and family traditions, these foreign women were unable to mix with the general mass of Persian women, with the consequence that from then on there began to be among us the two categories of women I have mentioned. Well then, owing to the fact that the majority of these foreign women, living freely among us in Persia and going about everywhere in the markets and other public places, often became objects for the gaze of our Persian men, there was gradually formed in the latter, of course unconsciously, along with the already existing attitude towards women as mothers, yet another attitude towards women as simply females. The property of having this definite double attitude towards women, being transmitted by inheritance from generation to generation, has even among us finally become so rooted that at the present time our men not only distinguish these two categories of women by their appearance as easily as one distinguishes between a man, a sheep, a dog, an ass, etc., but there has even been formed in them a certain something which instinctively prevents them from mistaking a woman of one category for a woman of another. Even I myself could always unmistakably tell from a distance what sort of woman was passing. How I could tell this, whether by their walk or by some other sign, with the best will in the world, I could not now explain. But it is a fact that I could tell and was never mistaken, although, as I have already told you, both categories of women wore similar veils. And every normal Persian, normal in the sense of not being under the influence of tambak, alcohol, or opium, the consumption of which has in recent times been unfortunately spreading among us ever more and more, can always unmistakably tell which woman represents a woman mother and which a woman female, that is, a prostitute. To every Persian among us, a woman mother, to whatever religion she may belong and regardless of family and personal relationships, is as his own sister, and a woman of the second category simply an animal who infallibly evokes in him a feeling of aversion. This property of instinctive relationship towards women is very strong in our men and is entirely independent of our consciousness. For example, even suppose it should happen somehow or other that the youngest and most beautiful woman of any district should find herself in the same bed with a man of the same district. This Persian man, even with all his willingness, provided, I repeat, that he were not under the influence of opium or alcohol, would be organically unable to treat her as a female. He would treat her as his own sister, and even if she herself should manifest organic actions towards him, he would pity her the more, and regard her as possessed by an unclean power, and would try his best to help her free herself from this misfortune. And the same Persian man will, in a normal condition, also treat a woman of the second category, that is, a prostitute, as a woman female, since, however young and beautiful she may be, he will inevitably experience an organic aversion to her. Nor could he treat her as a woman unless there had been introduced into his organism the toxic products, maleficent for people, which I have enumerated. And so, respected doctor, I lived until my 20th year in Persia under these morals and traditions like every ordinary, normal Persian. At 20, on account of shares I had inherited, I happened to become a partner in a certain large firm which exported Persian dried fruits to various European communities. and my position in this firm, thanks to various circumstances independent of me, was such that I had to be its chief local representative in those countries of the continent of Europe to which these fruits were exported. At first, as I have already told you, I went to Russia, then I went to Germany, Italy, and to other European countries, and now, finally, I have lived here in France already 7 years. In the life of none of these foreign countries does there exist any such sharply drawn distinction between these two types of women, between the woman mother and the woman prostitute, as I saw and felt during the whole of my youth in my native country. Everywhere among them, the attitude towards women is purely mental, that is, only thought out, not organic. For instance, a husband here, however unfaithful his wife may be, will never know it unless he sees or hears of it. But among us in Persia, without any seeing or any gossip, a husband can tell instinctively whether his wife is faithful, and the same thing applies to the woman. A woman among us can feel any infidelity on the part of her husband. As to this special instinctive feeling in people, several scientists from the continent of Europe have recently even made among us some very serious special investigations. As I happened by chance to learn, they came to the clear conclusion that in general, where polyandry and polygamy prevail, that is to say, where more than one wife and more than one husband are permitted by the established local morale, there is acquired in people a peculiar psycho-organic particularity in their relations as men and women. This psycho-organic particularity exists also in the people of our Persia, in consequence of the fact that, as you know, we, being followers of the Mohammedan religion, have the custom of polygamy. That is to say, each man is permitted by law to have as many as 7 wives. And this psycho-organic particularity in our Persian people, by the way, is that the feeling of the husband's infidelity never arises in any of the lawful wives concerning his other lawful wives. Such a feeling appears in one of the wives only when her husband is unfaithful with a strange woman. It is only now, respected doctor, that living here in Europe and seeing all that goes on between husbands and wives, I fully appreciate our custom of polygamy, so extremely sensibly established and so beneficial both for men and for women. Although every man among us is permitted several wives, and not simply one, as is the case here in Europe, where the Christian religion, which allows only one wife, is predominant, yet the honesty and conscientiousness of our men towards their wives are beyond compare with the honesty and conscientiousness existing among men here towards their one wife and their family in general. Just look around and see what is going on everywhere here. Glance around merely at these rooms of the Grand Café, where besides the ordinary professional prostitutes and gigolos, who are constantly here, hundreds of men and women are always sitting at the little tables, gaily conversing. Looking at these men and women now, you would say they were married couples who have come here together, either to see Paris or on some family business. But as a matter of fact, it is practically certain that in all the halls of this Grand Café there is not a single couple among these men and women, so gaily chatting and about to go to some hotel together, who are legal man and wife, even though, at the same time, every one of them may be, on paper, a legal husband or wife. The other legal halves of the men and women sitting here, who have remained at home in the provinces and are probably now thinking and telling their acquaintances positively that their legal wife or legal husband has gone to the world capital Paris to make some very important purchases for the family, or to meet somebody there very important for the family, or something else of the same sort. But in reality, in order to get here, these birds of passage have had to intrigue for a whole year and cook up every kind of story to convince their legal halves of the necessity of their trip. And now here, in the company of deceivers and intriguers like themselves, in the name of and to the glory of the significance of the epithalamium, aided by that fine art which this great contemporary civilization has attained, they decorate their stay-at-home legal halves with the largest possible fine art horns. In Europe, thanks to the established order of family life, it has now already come about that if you meet a man and a woman together and notice that while conversing, gay tones are heard in their voices and smiles appear on their faces, you can then be quite sure that very soon, if they have not already done so, they will very effectively and without fail put on some legal half, a pair of the largest and most beautiful horns. Hence, it is that any one slightly cunning man here may already be accounted a very honorable man, and the patriarchal father of a family. To those around him, it is of no concern that his honorable and patriarchal father of a family has perhaps at the same time, if of course his means permit, as many mistresses as he pleases on the side. On the contrary, those around him here usually show even more respect for such a man than for one who is unable to have any mistresses at all. Here, these honorable husbands, who have the means, not only have on the side, in addition to their one legal wife, 7, but sometimes even 7 times 7 illegal wives. And those European husbands who have not the means of supporting several illegal wives in addition to their one legal wife, spend almost the whole of their time in what is called drooling. That is to say, for days on end, they stare at and, as it were, devour with their eyes every woman they meet. In other words, in their thoughts or in their feelings, they betray their one legal wife an innumerable number of times. But although among us in Persia a man can have as many as 7 legal wives, yet nevertheless all his thoughts and feelings are occupied day and night how he can best arrange both the inner and the outer life of these legal wives of his, and the latter, in their turn, are absorbed in him and try their utmost also, day and night, to aid him in his life duties. Here, the reciprocal inner relationship between husband and wife is the same, just as almost all the inner life of the husband is spent in being unfaithful to his one legal wife. So also the inner life of this one wife, from the first day of their union, is always straying outside the family. For a European wife, as a rule, as soon as she is married, her husband becomes for her inner life, as they say, her own property. After the first night, being then secure in her ownership, she begins to devote the whole of her inner life to the pursuit of a certain something, that is, to the pursuit of that indefinable ideal, which from early childhood is gradually formed in every European girl, thanks to that famous education, which is ever more and more always being invented for them by various contemporary, conscienceless writers. During my stay in these European countries, I have observed that there is never formed in the being of a woman here that something which should, in her as in our women, constantly maintain what is called organic shame, or at least the disposition to it, upon which feeling, in my opinion, what is called wifely duty is based, and which is just what instinctively aids her to refrain from these actions which make a woman immoral. That is why every woman here can very easily, at any favorable opportunity, without either suffering or remorse of conscience, betray her legal husband. It is, in my opinion, owing to the absence of this shame and then, that here in Europe the line dividing the woman mother from the woman prostitute has gradually ceased to exist, and that these two categories of women have already long ago been merged into one, so that at the present time there is neither in the mind nor in the feelings of the men here that division of women into two categories which almost every Persian makes. Here one can now distinguish the woman mother from the woman female only if one sees all her manifestations with one's own eyes. In the European conditions of family life, owing to the absence of the beneficent institution of polygamy, an institution which, in my opinion, should long ago have been introduced here, if only for the simple reason that, as statistics show, The women here far outnumber the men. There are thousands of other discomforts and improprieties which need not exist at all. And so, respected doctor, the fundamental cause of my second vice was that, being born and brought up in traditions of morality entirely opposed to those here, I came here at an age when the animal passions in a man are especially strong. The ensuing evils for me personally arose chiefly from the fact that I came here while still very young, and according to the notions here, handsome. And owing to my genuine southern type, a great many women here, for whom I represented a new and original type of male, began a regular hunt after me. They hunted me like big game, and I was big game for them, not only on account of my specific type, a genuine southerner, but also on account of my gentleness and courtesy towards women, properties which had been instilled in me from my earliest childhood in my associations with our Persian women mothers. When I came here and began meeting the women here, I was, of course, even unconsciously on my part, gentle and courteous towards them also. And so, meeting with the women here, and at first only talking with them, chiefly on the subject of contemporary civilization, and of the backwardness, as it were, of our Persia in comparison, I then, of course, under the influence of alcohol, which I was then already consuming in rather large quantities, fell for the first time, that is to say, I, as a prospective father of a family, behaved vilely. Although this cost me, at the time, much suffering and remorse of conscience, yet the environment, together again with the action of this alcohol, caused me to fall a second time, and thereafter everything headed, so to say, down, an inclined plane, and led to the point where I am now indeed, in this respect, a most filthy animal. Especially now at times, whenever I happen to be completely free from the influence of alcohol, I suffer moral anguish and loathe myself with the whole of my being. And at such moments, I hasten all the more to pour this alcohol onto myself again in order to forget myself and thus drown my sufferings. Having lived this ugly life in the countries of Europe, I enumerated, I finally settled down here in Paris, in precisely that European city to which women come from every part of Europe and from other continents with the obvious intention of putting horns on their other legal halves. And here in Paris, I have now become entirely addicted to both these human vices, that is, to alcohol and, as you have said, to petticoat chasing. And I run left and right without any sane reasoning at all. And now the satisfaction of both these vices is more necessary to me than the satisfaction of my hunger. That is how it has all gone with me up to the present moment, and what will come next I do not know, and do not care to know. I always even try my best and struggle with myself not to think about it. As he said these last words, he sincerely sighed and dejectedly dropped his head. I then asked him, "But tell me, please, are you really not afraid of being infected with those terrible diseases which these women usually suffer from, whom a petticoat chaser like you runs after?" At this question of mine, he again sighed deeply, and after a short pause told me as follows. My esteemed and worthy doctor, in recent years I have thought about this question a great deal. It has even become for me a subject of such interest that in a certain sense it has been a blessed means, whereby my inner odious life has in spite of everything flowed more or less endurably. As a physician, you will, I think, probably be greatly interested to know how and why this same question interested me so much several years ago, and to what conclusions I arrived after I had, in a relatively normal state, very seriously observed and studied it.